Hi, with my long-running serial Tales from the Triverse nearly ended. I mean, I say nearly. It's looking like January is going to be the wrap-up for that, and I've been writing it for 4.5 years and putting out a chapter every week on Substack via the newsletter. So it's been an ongoing thing for a very long time. And I thought, as I'm nearly at the end of it, it might be quite fun to go back to the start and talk about some of the inspirations behind it, and like the different influences that impacted on me that then resulted in me coming up with this thing called Tales from the Triverse, which you can read over on my Substack for free. There's a lot of it though, just to be warned. So yeah, in no particular order, just to go through some of the kind of key texts, I suppose, that influenced my writing and ideas, and particularly around Triverse and how that all came together. So to start with, I'm going to go with The Wire, which is a TV show that I came to really late. The Wire, certainly in the UK, seemed a bit kind of under the radar when it was actually like broadcasting. I wasn't really aware of it until it had finished, I think. Once the final season aired, that seemed to be in the UK at least when suddenly everybody was talking about it. And it was like the TV show that you had to watch, essentially. But as with a lot of those things, when everyone suddenly says, "Oh, you must watch this TV show, you must watch The Wire," my natural reaction sometimes is to be like, "Really? Like, why is everybody hyping this thing?" Anyway, it turned out when we did actually watch The Wire, that it was very good, and it's a case of the hype probably underselling it, in my opinion. It's a remarkable thing, and still feels really unusual. So I kind of grew up loving the 22, 23 episode US format of TV shows, like really long seasons, season every year, that kind of thing. And also, we've moved away from that now. We've got the more kind of streaming approach where it's anything between 6 to 12 episodes and the pacing's a bit all over the shop. The Wire, being an HBO show, was in theory a bit more like the modern streaming shows, but this was back when like HBO were making stuff to that format in a very specific way, and it was his own thing, really. It wasn't just that it happened to have fewer episodes; like it was designed around that structure. And the unique thing with The Wire, at least in terms of what I've seen, is that each season had a completely different focus and a different theme that it was focusing on. Like one season looks at the education system in Baltimore. It obviously starts with looking at the drug trade and how that works, both from the police and the cops' perspective. Very much treated like all angles equally in terms of exploring why people were doing what they were doing. And because the story shifted with each season, it also meant that the cast kind of stayed on rotation, I suppose. Like the people that were the lead characters in season 1 were not necessarily the lead characters in season 2, 3, 4 as it went along, which was a bit weird. Like getting used to watching The Wire, it did take a while, and I think the creators have talked about how season 1 they kind of eased into it, and it was a little bit like they having to train viewers on how to understand this like slightly weird TV show. But the overall impact that it creates over those, is it 5 seasons, 4 or 5 seasons, is like nothing else. Like the picture it paints of what it's like in that particular slice of time to live in Baltimore was remarkable. And obviously loads of actors came out of that and have gone on to do extremely well. Like when we finished watching The Wire, I sort of had a moment where I didn't quite know what my television was for. Like having finished The Wire, like nothing was ever going to be as good as that TV show for me. And I was like, well, there's no point having a television anymore. Like what else is there? So yeah, that was The Wire. And although Tales from the Triverse is this kind of slightly crazy science fiction fantasy mashup, I wanted the tone of it and the structure of it to feel a little bit like The Wire, where characters come and go, and it has this sprawling exploration of the culture through the lens of crime and the police, but without being tied down to like too closely to a small cast, and also able to sort of go wherever it wanted to in order to explore the themes that it wanted to talk about. That was something I wanted to make sure was in the structure of Triverse. So yeah, moving on to the next thing, staying within crime, but moving into superhero territory, sort of, is a comic called Gotham Central, which ran for a few volumes. Again, this is something I came to really late. I didn't read it when it was being published, but I grabbed all the trade paperbacks at a later date. It's by Ed Brubaker, Greg Rooker, Michael Lark, and the interesting thing about Gotham Central is the way it treats its genre, I suppose. So, although it's in theory a Batman comic, Batman's basically not in it. It's purely from the perspective of the Gotham police force. Batman sometimes shows up for a panel right at the end of an issue, usually getting in the way of the cops and being generally quite irritating. And it's kind of showing that from the perspective of these professional lawmakers, Batman's presence in the city is actually a chaotic element that they would rather was not there. But the thing that's really interesting is the way it takes a genre that is quite well established, as in the superhero genre and the Batman character and setting with all the villains and what have you, and then sort of flips it on its head a little bit. And just by doing it from a different perspective, refreshes the whole thing. So in an early issue, I think it might be the first issue even, as a good example, there's a couple of cops on a routine call out. There's been a disturbance at an apartment somewhere, and they bust in on this apartment where they're expecting a domestic incident or something, something they can handle pretty easily. They open this door, and inside is Mr. Freeze. And Mr. Freeze has a very silly name. He has quite a silly design. Anyone who watched Batman and Robin back in the 90s probably can't get Arnold Schwarzenegger's bizarre, terrible performance out of their heads. This is not a baddie that is easy to take seriously, I suppose, until you suddenly do it from the perspective of two beat cops who have just encountered this slightly mad guy with a very dangerous freeze weapon. All very pulpy stuff, but treated in a really interesting way that suddenly Mr. Freeze becomes terrifying. He's actually scary in a way that he never is when the story is following Batman, because Batman operates at a similar level of heightened reality. Whereas from the position of two policemen, this is a terrifying situation. I don't know why they work in Gotham. But anyway, so again, that's a kind of a tonal example. It's the sort of vibe I was going for, but also that undermining of genre expectation, I suppose. Anyone that's read Triverse, probably that anecdote I just said about Mr. Freeze, that's very similar to one of the opening stories in Triverse, where again, two policemen in London this time, on a routine call, encounter a large dragon-like creature just in the East End of London. And that kind of immediately sets the tone for the readers as to what Triverse is going to be doing and is kind of all about. So moving further into science fiction territory, Iain Banks is a big inspiration behind the more science fiction end of Triverse. I've read 3 of Iain Banks's culture novels so far. I'm slowly working my way through them. And this is something, I think the theme here is that I came to a lot of this stuff quite late. So I only started reading Iain Banks after he'd passed away. So there's kind of a sadness to me reading his books, knowing that each time I read one, there's no more coming, but they're incredible. And I wish I'd read them as a younger person when they were coming out. His sci-fi is sort of, I would say quietly subversive. It's pretty full on at times, but he does it in a really sneaky, clever way. His stuff's really political, but it's often not at all about the politics. It's just there in the world. And actually each of the books is focusing on other aspects entirely. But yeah, his sort of casual world building where he's depicting entirely insane, mad things, the likes of which you've never read about, let alone you've certainly never seen it on screen or anything like that. And he just does it like it's just no effort for him to make the stuff up. I'm sure it was, but he makes it look effortless. So yeah, obviously I'm not saying that I'm writing anywhere near his level, but if I was to pick someone to aspire to, he would be up there. And then similarly, another science fiction author that I've loved for years is Stanley Robinson. So he wrote a trilogy of books about colonizing Mars back in the 90s, I think, which are big chunky books. When I finished reading this trilogy, I sort of thought I'd been to Mars. Like, it's so all-encompassing and all-involving. And, he certainly back then went into a level of detail that put him in the sort of hard sci-fi territory, I suppose. That's not something I do. I don't have the scientific knowledge to do that kind of thing. But what I think I do like about him is the verisimilitude of his stories, regardless of how much you engage with the science aspect. Like, it feels like it could all happen, that it's kind of real. There's a lot in Triverse that obviously could not happen, but I wanted it to have the feel of something that had, texture and realism, and like it had thought put into it. One interesting thing about Stanley Robinson is, like, my favourite book of his is Galileo's Dream, which is one of his more recent-ish books. And it has a real kind of fantasy element to it, which you don't see so much in his other work. But it's a beautiful thing. It's sort of a biography of Galileo, but also very much not. And it does some structural things with the narrative that are really cool, which I won't spoil. But yeah, highly recommend Galileo's Dream. If you want to check out Stanley Robinson and you've not read any of his stuff, maybe give that one a go. Even though it's quite different to his other work, it's amazing. So switching over to television for a moment. Well, television and books. There's The Expanse. So I've started reading the novels as well, but I absolutely adored the Expanse TV show. From a world building, story, characters, the general production quality of it was just ridiculous. There's still not been anything quite like it that I've seen. Although I hear that Apple TV has some very good sci-fi, but alas, I have not ventured into the Apple ecosystem yet. So maybe one day I'll check that stuff out. But yeah, again, the science fiction side of Triverse, because there's sort of multiple dimensions in Triverse, and it's all about the cultural collision of those three spaces. And the more sci-fi kind of futuristic end, the feel of it is very much Expanse, in terms of the way the solar system has been colonized and the way space travel works. Like, it's not Star Wars. It's very much more down the sort of semi-pseudo-realistic, like feels real, even if it's, been dramatically tweaked for plot purposes. That kind of feel that The Expanse gives. Back when I was conceiving of Triverse, I couldn't decide if I wanted to write another fantasy novel or go full sci-fi, or write, have a go at crime fiction, which is something I hadn't done before. In the end, I did all three and mashed them together in this slightly cheaty way using portals, which is, one of the benefits of writing speculative fiction. But the reason I was interested in the crime fiction is, at the time, I'd worked for several years helping out on a crime fiction festival here in Norwich, which was called Noirwich, which was a name that was either genius or ridiculous, depending on your point of view. But going to that festival and meeting a lot of the authors, and some big name authors came to that thing. It was just fascinating stuff. And crime fiction, I think, was something that I read a lot when I was younger. I loved that Agatha Christie type stuff. I've always liked whodunits and that kind of thing, but I've maybe not stuck with it over the years. And hearing the authors talk about their work was brilliant. There's a particular lecture by Megan Abbott that she gave at Noirwich in 2021, I think. So it was just as I was gearing up to write Triverse, and it really stuck in my head and dictated a lot of how I approached the crime procedural aspect in the investigations. In that she was talking about how crime fiction traditionally and historically has often focused a lot on the police and also on the perpetrators. So you have like the voices of authority with the police, and you have the baddies, the criminals who are doing terrible things and have to be stopped. And that's kind of like the structure of an awful lot of crime fiction. And an overlooked aspect is often the victim. Like, the victim is basically a MacGuffin, a plot device to enable the police to investigate something and then catch a bad guy. And that really stuck with me, because she was basically saying, actually the victims deserve slightly better stories. And if you read Triverse, like, a lot of the time, the focus is on the victims of the various crimes that come up in the thing. Often what happens to the perpetrator is not covered in great detail. It's, I don't think it's that important. Even, if the police do catch them, like, it's okay, they're going to be dealt with. Actually, the focus that I was interested in is sticking with the victims of whatever the crime was, and the impact on them and on society and that kind of thing. Okay, going back into television and going back in time a bit as well to the 1990s, the TV show Babylon 5 continues to be a ridiculously large kind of thing on my shoulder, I suppose. So this was like the TV show I watched as a teenager, and it was hugely formative in my appreciation of storytelling and long form storytelling in particular in serial format. It was one of the earliest TV shows, particularly in science fiction. Like police dramas had actually done it a little bit, but in science fiction, it was one of the earliest attempts to do a kind of long-running story arc all the way through multiple seasons of a TV show, when at the time it was much more common to do just standalone episodes. And these days, obviously, if you look at stuff on Netflix, like, you don't really get things with standalone episodes. It's all plot-centric stuff. And I actually quite like having that mix-up. And that's something I took into Triverse, where a lot of the stories are kind of standalone. You can read them in any order you want. But there's also this on-running plot in the background that's kind of bubbling up and becomes more and more prominent over time. So someone who reads from the start and goes all the way through is going to pick up on those threads. And then, about halfway through, that becomes more important. And then at some point, there's a point of no return. And then the story enters its climax and the kind of procedural stuff shifts over into something more focused. But, that structure of shifting between individual standalone episodes and a long-running arc, that very much is something that I first encountered with Babylon 5, and I think it's still one of the best examples of the form. Talking of that, if it going back even earlier into the 1980s, like when I was 7 years old, basically, I think my very earliest encounter with serial fiction, and I only realized this relatively recently, was actually in the Transformers comic. And specifically, this is the UK comic. So there's a slightly convoluted situation where the comic, I think, came out monthly in America, and in the UK it was coming out weekly. So they had to make more stories to fill in the gaps. And a writer called Simon Furman became basically the UK comics writer for the Transformers comic. This was obviously intended to be aimed at kids who are buying toys, or, asking their parents to buy toys. Simon Furman, for some reason, took this job extremely seriously and ended up over 6 years or so telling this absurdly complex story with time travel and huge cast of characters and in epic interstellar implications around theology and war and all this kind of stuff. It was heady, intense stuff for an 8-year-old. I think I was about 10 or 11 when the comic wrapped up. But yeah, it was good stuff, and it was an example for me early on of how, if you get a writer who takes the material seriously, doesn't matter how silly the material is or how ridiculous its origins. In that case, it's a toy line that Hasbro's trying to sell. That's the extremely commercial capitalist origin of that thing. But if you get a writer, an artist who put the effort in, it can turn into something far better than it has any right to be. But also in terms of interweaving complex plots over a very long period of time, and it's still holding together. And I think comics are interesting because with Triverse, I have been writing chapters and publishing them as I go along. I didn't write the entire thing ahead of time and then just chop it up and send it out week by week. I write it live to the page, which a lot of people think is a little bit mad. But actually, that's how comics have been written for ages. When the early issues of a comic are being written, they haven't finished all the issues up to issue 100 or whatever. And that's going to happen years later. So you're committing to certain story beats and character arcs and pacing that has to be right. Or if it isn't right, you have to roll with the punches and figure out how to make it right down the line. Okay, so last couple of things. This is a bit of an unusual one, I suppose, but there's a TV show that came out maybe 8 years ago or so, which I would never have watched if we didn't have a young child. So my son was born in 2012. So I think he was maybe 5 or so when we started watching this. This was called She-Ra and the Princesses of Power. This is a remake of a He-Man spin-off from the 1980s. So it's all very convoluted. anyway, it's the showrunner was N.D. Stevenson, who did a great job with it. It was a really interesting reinvention of old material, but we just sort of wrapped up watching this as I was starting to put Triverse together. And yeah, the vibe's very different. The TV show is aimed very much at younger viewers, but has a lot of character depth in it that actually is one of those rare things that as parents, I think we enjoyed it as much as our son did when we were watching it. And anyone who's a parent and has to watch TV with younger children knows, when you stumble upon something, it's actually genuinely good and well written, and it's not, you're not kind of watching it through like clenched teeth. That's a special moment. Anyway, so that was really great. But it has a very affirmative, positive kind of angle to it, and that vibe I wanted to imbue into the fantasy end of Triverse. It kind of ended up going in a darker direction in the end, but I think that sense of hope and never giving up, that was an aspect that I wanted to get in there. And actually, the way Triverse was written, depending on which of the three universes they're in. So there's this fantasy world, which is very much there's dragons and magic and that kind of stuff. Then there's a futuristic sci-fi world where there's spaceships and the solar system's colonized. And then there's 1970s London, which is the kind of main focus with the police department that's been set up to deal with portal-related crimes. And that's kind of the lens through which we see everything. But I wanted the stories to shift through sort of genre tropes and expectations depending on where we were. So, stories set in London in the 70s have a more gritty crime procedural vibe. If we go into the science fiction end of things, that's when it starts to feel like, ideally, hopefully, Iain Banks, Stanley Robinson, The Expanse. Those are kind of the reference points. And when it goes into the fantasy world, I didn't want it to be like traditional Tolkien or anything like that. And actually, that She-Ra show was kind of a good starting point that I then went off down a sort of more convoluted, darker route. I guess while I was writing Triverse, I was reading Kieran Gillen's Die, so that ended up not so much a direct influence because it's so unique. But I think Kieran Gillen is always an inspiration just in the way he constructs his worlds and finds ways to do something that you think's been done a million times before, and then he finds a new way to do it, which you never thought of. Which again, just something to aspire to, whether you get there or not. So yeah, those are all the kind of fictional inspirations behind Tales from the Triverse. Just to go through them again. So we've got The Wire, Gotham Central comic, Iain Banks's Culture novels, just everything by Stanley Robinson, basically. The Expanse TV show and the books. Crime fiction is a sort of genre generally, but also in particular, do look up on YouTube the Noirwich lecture by Megan Abbott. That is worth a watch. Got the TV show Babylon 5. We have Transformers comics from the 1980s, written by Simon Furman. Actually, I've got another comic, a more recent comic by Simon Furman, which is in fact crime fiction called 5 Points. I'm fascinated to read this. I haven't got around to it yet because I've not read anything by Simon Furman that isn't like from my childhood. So seeing what he's been up to since then is going to be pretty cool. And then the Netflix remake of She-Ra. There's obviously a ton of other reference points that have gone into the story, but those are more real world references, political, social, cultural things that have happened before and during the writing of the story. But I think I'll get into those in another chat at some point. I'm going to spin out some of these into more detailed posts where I can really get into it. But yeah, I won't get into the political inspirations behind Triverse just yet, because that's a whole other can of worms. Okay, I will leave it there. But yeah, thank you everyone who popped along. Nice to see you all, and hope you're having a good 2026 so far, because apparently we're in 2026, which is slightly alarming. But yeah, if you're interested in reading Tales from the Triverse based on any of those inspirations I've just been yammering about, just head over to my Substack and you can find the whole thing there to read for free. But yeah, like I say, it's very long, so do brace yourself. Okay, thanks for watching. I will catch you another time.